At first, I didn't realize that something was wrong. I thought it was just a coincidence. Nighttime noises, tricks of the imagination, the usual creaking of an old house, or the rustling of trees outside my window. My house stood alone at the very edge of the village, the last house on the road, beyond which lay only fields and a dense forest stretching all the way to the river. I was used to silence. In the evenings, there were no neighbors to hear through thin walls, no cars rumbling down the road. I lived alone, and I was perfectly fine with that. But over time, I started noticing that something strange was happening at night. Every night, exactly at 3 o'clock, I would wake up to a strange sound. At first, I couldn't quite make it out. It was quiet, blending into the wind, the rustling leaves, or the creaking floorboards. But every time, it made me open my eyes. The sound was like a voice, but not entirely human. There were no clear words, just a faint, muffled call. It came from somewhere outside the window, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. It wasn't an owl, not a wolf, not any other familiar sound of the night. It was something else. I tried to ignore it. I would turn over, close my eyes, and force myself to sleep again. But I couldn't. The one who called never stopped. For the first few nights, I convinced myself it had to be something logical. Maybe the wind created this effect, or a fox wandering near my house, searching for food. But every time I gathered the courage to peek out the window, I saw nothing. No one. One night, I decided I couldn't just lie there and wait anymore. When the sound came again, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold night air wrapped around me immediately. It was quiet, too quiet. I stood on the porch listening. My heart pounded so loudly, it felt like it echoed in the empty night. And then I saw the footprints. The ground was damp from recent rain, and the prints were clear. They led around the house, toward the old shed I hadn't used in years. The impressions were strange, too deep, as if the person had been standing there for a long time or moving with difficulty. I slowly moved forward. My steps sounded muffled, as if the night itself was swallowing the sound. Near the shed, something was lying on the ground. It was an old jacket. It looked like it had been left there recently. It wasn't wet from the dew yet. Something about it unsettled me. Cautiously, I stepped closer and touched it with my fingertips. And that's when the air changed. The feeling that I wasn't alone became almost tangible. I thought I heard breathing, heavy, barely audible, somewhere very close. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam of light swept across the tall grass, the shed's walls, the distant trees. But there was no one there. But I knew just a second ago, someone had been. I quickly grabbed the jacket and felt something hard in its pocket. I pulled it out. It was a piece of paper. It was damp, slightly crumpled, but I managed to make out the words. It was a list, some dates, some notes. But one detail made my blood run cold. One of the dates was tomorrow. I didn't know what it meant, but I no longer wanted to stay outside. I dropped the jacket and rushed back into the house, locking every bolt and latch. The next morning, I took the note to the police. It turned out it belonged to a man who had disappeared from our village 3 months ago. His body was never found. After that night, the sound never came again. But every time I pass by the shed, I can't shake the feeling that someone is standing there in the tall grass. I never believed in the supernatural. There was always a logical explanation for everything. Every strange sound, every unexpected shadow. The creaking of the floor? Just old wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Flickering shadows in the dark? A simple trick of the light, a game of the imagination. I had never been one to jump at ghost stories or feel uneasy in the dark. But one night changed everything. I had been renting a small house on the outskirts of town for a few months. It was an old but cozy cottage, nestled right at the edge of a dense forest. The house was somewhat isolated, with no neighbors close by. The nearest house was about a 10-minute walk away, and the rest was just trees, stretching endlessly into the darkness. I liked the solitude. It gave me peace. No noisy streets, no sounds of people shouting or cars honking. Just the wind rustling the leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the distant howl of a coyote. It was peaceful until it wasn't. At first, I didn't even notice when things started to feel off. It happened on an ordinary evening. I had been out late meeting a friend in town, and by the time I returned home, it was already close to midnight. As I pulled up the long dirt driveway, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In my bedroom window, there was a silhouette. It stood motionless in the dimly lit room, looking outside, directly at me. For a moment, I just sat there in my car, staring at the dark figure. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Had I left a coat hanging in front of the window? Maybe it was a trick of the reflection, but deep down, I knew. I had left the house empty. No one should be inside. I reached for my phone, ready to call the police, but in that split second that I glanced away, the figure disappeared. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. The house was completely dark. Nothing moved. Had I imagined it? Gathering my courage, I stepped out of the car and slowly made my way to the front door. My hands trembled as I unlocked it, pushing it open. The house was silent. Too silent. The air inside felt heavy, almost suffocating. I checked every room, turning on all the lights as I went. The doors were still locked. The windows were shut. There was no sign of forced entry. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I barely slept. Days passed without incident, and I convinced myself it had just been my imagination. Maybe I was tired. Maybe my mind had played a trick on me. Then one night I woke up suddenly. A cold sensation crept up my spine, and I felt it again, that unbearable sensation of being watched. I turned my head towards the window, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. And that's when I saw them. Two faint, shadowy shapes, barely distinguishable in the darkness. Eyes. They were watching me from just beyond the tree line. They weren't glowing like an animal's eyes reflecting light. They weren't moving. They just stared. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, frozen in place, my gaze locked onto those distant eyes. They didn't blink. They didn't shift. They were just there, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I rushed outside to check the yard. The ground was soft from last night's rain, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been standing there. But when I stepped back inside, I noticed something unsettling. The curtain in the living room had been pulled back slightly, as if someone had been standing there, watching me while I slept. From that night on, I woke up every time at the same hour, always feeling the same eerie presence. And each night, the eyes were closer. At first, they were at the edge of the forest. Then a few nights later, they were near the fence. And then they were in my yard. I stopped sleeping properly. Every noise made me jump. I kept the lights on at all times, but it didn't help. The feeling of being watched never left. One night, I finally reached my breaking point. I couldn't just sit there, paralyzed with fear. I had to confront whatever it was. Gripping a flashlight and a knife, I stepped outside. The cold night air hit me immediately, making me shiver. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against my ears. I shone the flashlight around the yard. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees, the fence, the empty space near my window. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate click. It came from behind me. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly turned around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. My bedroom window reflected the beam of light, and for a split second, just a split second, I saw it, the reflection of someone standing inside my room. But when I spun around to look directly, the room was empty. That was the last night I spent in that house. I packed my things the next morning and left. I don't know what I saw, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, even now, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel it again. That unbearable sensation. The certainty that something, somewhere, is still watching me. My friend and I decided to go on a spontaneous road trip, planning to drive a few hundred kilometers to explore some new places. Neither of us expected this journey to leave such an unforgettable impression. The route took us through old, nearly forgotten roads, stretching between forests and fields, connecting small, unnoticed villages. We weren't planning to turn back, as we both had a goal of reaching a larger city much further down the road. But that night, our plans changed. The sky began to darken, and before we could reach the next city, we veered off the main highway onto a narrow road leading into the forest. The further we drove, the darker it became, and the car's signal weakened from time to time. Somehow, we found ourselves on an utterly deserted stretch of road, with no signs of life around, not even a single turn for miles. As the kilometers passed, the surrounding landscape became eerily quiet, and the air grew thick with an unsettling sense. The view seemed almost surreal, trees blending into the horizon. The air, although cool, felt oppressive. We didn't rush to stop until it was nearly pitch black. Only when the rain began to fall heavier did we decide to make a brief stop. We left the car on the shoulder of the road. The moment I stepped out, I felt a strange, uneasy sensation. I couldn't pinpoint why, but everything looked oddly familiar. Too familiar. The place, the trees, even the small stone fence along the road. It was all unsettlingly reminiscent of something I'd seen before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been here, just in a different context. My friend was walking ahead and stopped suddenly. I walked up to him and noticed how he stood completely still, staring into the distance. At first, I thought it was just the landscape, but something felt off. There, about 30 meters away, stood a figure. It looked like a man in a dark cloak, standing motionless. At first, it seemed like part of the scenery, but the longer I stared, the more I felt that this figure didn't belong. It was different. It felt like it had been standing there for an eternity. I tried to ignore it, but my friend didn't. He seemed unusually calm, yet there was an unmistakable anxiety in his face. Like me, he couldn't stop staring at the figure. We both began to feel uncomfortable when we realized that the figure didn't move. It remained still, even as we began heading back to the car. Once we got back in the vehicle and started driving again, I couldn't believe my eyes. When I glanced at the rearview mirror, the man was still there, standing on the road. Now I could see that his face was hidden. Instead, the darkness around him deepened, his shadow expanding, stretching farther than it should have. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. I began to speed up, trying to get away from the strange feeling. But then I looked back in the mirror once more. The shadow was following us, matching our every move. It was like we couldn't escape it. The further we drove, the more we felt trapped, as though the shadow had us in its grasp. We continued on for several more kilometers, but the road didn't change. It felt like we were driving in circles, passing the same scenery over and over again. When I looked in the rearview mirror again, the shadow was no longer behind us. It was directly in front of us. Now, the outline was even clearer, and we were forced to look into the darkness ahead, which seemed to consume us. We realized that even if we stopped, nothing would change. This was a trap. The shadows chasing us were growing larger, and it seemed like we had entered some kind of inescapable reality where there was no way out. And then, when we understood that there was nowhere to go, that we couldn't move forward anymore, we saw the man standing directly in front of us on the road. Now, he was so close that his shadow seemed to blur with the night. And as we looked at him, we realized the chilling truth. We had been on this road for far too long. The shadow wasn't just following us anymore. It had become a part of our journey. Since that moment, I can never forget the feeling of glancing in the rearview mirror, seeing the face of my fears slowly materializing in the place we had just passed.